Allan, thank you. So let me begin with a statement that is so obvious that it is in fact blindingly obvious. But I'll say it anyway. I am going to die. And so are you. We are all on a journey to the same destination, except that we do not know when we will arrive or how our lives will end. The American poet Galway Kinnell states it clearly. He wrote, life brings you death. Life brings you death. There is no other road. So how many have accepted that reality? Comfortable in your heart, knowing that your life will end, but not knowing when or how. A few Sundays ago, Tracy told the story of a passenger on the Titanic who was from Lambton County, and she shared his story. Another passenger on the Titanic was called William John Rogers, and he was a third-class passenger from Wales. And he wrote a postcard on the Titanic to his friend James Day. And this is what he wrote. Dear friend, just a line to show that I'm alive and kicking and going grand. It's a treat. He was so excited to be on the Titanic, sailing to New York. What an adventure. That night, as we know, the Titanic sank. Rogers went down with the ship. His body was never recovered. Death can be sudden, unexpected, and sometimes traumatic. But because some deaths are unexpected, we should not waste our lives worrying about something that may never happen. Of course, the majority of people will die from some medical condition, or if we live long enough, we will die from what's called natural causes. Living in Sarnia, I'm comforted knowing that should I develop a horrible disease, I can call on the experts in palliative care to make my end-of-life journey easier. Or I can access medical assistance in dying, an option that many people in other countries do not have. But it can be paralyzing to think about or to worry about when and how we will die, because living with a fear of death can prevent us from living our lives fully. That's the reality. If we live in fear of death, we are not able to live our lives fully. The fear of death can be perpetuated early in our lives by both religious beliefs and also by the culture that we live in. When I was a young boy growing up in Northern Ireland, I went to Sunday school and church every Sunday, and I learned that good children go to heaven when we die, and bad children go to hell when they die. The devil was a frightening, invisible figure in my imagination, and I knew that the devil burned people, bad people, after they died in a lake of fire, those who had led sinful, ungodly lives. So, therefore, I had to go to church every Sunday and Sunday school every Sunday afternoon, or I would be heading for eternal damnation. Such indoctrination could be labeled child abuse, and I would not disagree with that label. And then there is the cultural influence. In Victorian times, families often prepared the dead at home for burial in the local church cemetery. There was greater acknowledgement back then that mourning and grieving the loss of a loved one takes time. And wearing a black armband was something that a lot of people did who were in mourning the loss of a loved one, so that people that they met in public would see the black armband and realize that that person was mourning a loved one and that they should be treated kindly and with respect. Just one of the things the Victorians did. Today, we have largely handed responsibility for our dead to the funeral industry. Many deaths happen in a hospital or a hospice, and the body is soon on its way to a funeral home or crematorium. And it's that early separation of a deceased loved one from family that often happens soon after death, and the loss of opportunity to be with them for at least a little while. Maybe to wash the body and dress the body, as some cultures do. Time and ritual that can be healing. So this morning I will share some stories to show why it's important to come to terms with our mortality, and how a death cafe brings curious people together to discuss their questions and concerns around death and dying, listening respectfully and offering guidance and support. From the website, from the Death Cafe website, it says a death cafe is a group-directed discussion of death with no agenda, objectives, or themes. It's a discussion group rather than a grief support or counseling session. Our objective, it says, is to increase awareness of death with a view to helping people make the most of their finite lives. So there are now over 80 countries in the world where death cafes have been held, including Canada and the United States. I attended one in Chatham a few years ago, and Dan Danner, who's here today, and Chris attended one recently in Lexington, Michigan. The concept apparently began in 2004 with a sociologist in Switzerland. But his efforts apparently did not go well, and he gave up. Then in 2011, a man called John Underwood in England held the first successful death cafe in his mother's basement in London. And that one was a success. People who attended really benefited from the sharing of information and discussion. It was so successful that others found out about it, the word spread around, and lots of people wanted to know how they could attend a death cafe. So it took off. Sadly, John himself died too soon. Several years after holding the first death cafe, he became quite ill and was eventually diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. He died in 2017. He was just 44 years old. However, before he died, he got his mother and his sister to promise him that they would continue to promote death cafes and do what they could to help the movement catch on. So after this morning service, if anyone is interested in participating, we were going to hopefully have a short trial run of a death cafe for maybe just a half an hour or so, because I know it's lunchtime, we'll all be hungry. We will have cake, because Tracy has brought a beautiful cake with suitably decorated for a death cafe. So make sure you get a slice of that before you leave. And for those, maybe a few of us who want to stay for half an hour, we'll set up a table and gather around and have some cake and coffee. Because that's what you do at a death cafe. You sit around and you have cake and coffee and have fun. And I'm hoping maybe Richard and Doreen will join us, because Richard has experience in the funeral industry and he'll be able to offer his insights on that. And I know he is aware of the many, many changes which have happened in the funeral industry in recent years. So let me get back to William John Rogers on the Titanic and that postcard he wrote. How come that postcard survived? The Titanic did have about 10 or 12 telegraph operators who were paid by the first-class passengers. They were probably the only ones who could afford to send telegraphs. And they would send telegraphs back to people at home that the passengers wanted to send messages to. Probably very similar messages to what Rogers wrote. how happy they were to be on the Titanic, how excited they were. But William John Rogers was a third-class passenger. He probably couldn't afford to use an operator, telegram operator. So he wrote this postcard, and he may have given it to a crew member and asked him, to put it in with the mail for him. And obviously, that postcard didn't get into the mail, but the crew member presumably survived and had this postcard in his possession. Because as Tracy pointed out, the Titanic was not just a passenger ship, it was also a mail ship, the RMS Titanic, Royal Mail Ship. So there was a lot of mail on the Titanic, and most of it probably went down with the ship. But anyway, that postcard. The astronomer and philosopher Carl Sagan kept a copy of that postcard on his bathroom mirror, so he could see it every morning when he was shaving. And he said, Annie, his wife Anne Druin, he called her Annie. He said, Annie and I display the postcard for a reason. He said that they reflect on the words, just a line to show that I'm alive and kicking and going grand, it's a treat. Sagan said, we know that going grand can be the most temporary and illusory state. In the last book he wrote before he died of cancer, Carl Sagan wrote, in our vulnerability, Annie and I choose to look death in the eye and to be grateful every day for the brief but magnificent opportunity that life provides. As we know, however, death denialism is surprisingly common among people of all ages. A woman once told me in Sarnia that her husband panics if he sees a funeral procession going down the road. He panics to the extent that he has to turn his back. He can't even bear to look at a funeral procession. He can never imagine going into a funeral home. It just scares him to death. Pardon the pun. And speaking of funeral homes, let me share this story. Several years ago, Scott Smith, who's the owner of Smith Funeral Home, called me up and he said, Allan, wondered if you could do me a favor. I have some students coming in from Northern High School in a couple of days' time, and I was wondering if you could just give a short demonstration of what you do as a celebrant, as a lay chaplain, just to let them know, what happens in a funeral home and how important that is. I said, certainly, I would be delighted to do that. So I had to put together, a little 10-minute presentation for the students, and I wanted to do a short celebration of life. So who would I choose to celebrate? Whose life would I choose to celebrate? I was thinking maybe I'll use a fictitious name, maybe Joe Smith. Oh no, maybe Scott has an uncle called Joe. Okay, well, what about, a Harvey Wallbang or something like that? But ultimately, I decided to celebrate my life. And I had 3 objectives to do in those 10 minutes. And by the way, I got the funeral home to print up little memorial cards with my name on them. And we handed them out to the students. So I could see they were really, uncomfortable. But I had 3 objectives. Number 1 was to demonstrate that having a funeral or memorial service allows family and friends to publicly mourn the death, and those who attend to bring with them their understanding and support for the family. And that can help the grieving process begin in a meaningful way. Second objective was to let them know that every life is unique, and each person leaves a legacy that can be honored and celebrated. So I told them a little bit about my life, growing up in Belfast, growing up, falling in love with Dorothy, getting married, emigrating to Canada. And then I told them about all the volunteer opportunities I had taken advantage of in Sarnia here. I told him I was a big brother for 20 years, that I was an environmental activist, that I had run in 3 federal elections as a Green Party candidate, that I sat on the board of the Women's Interval Home, that I was a volunteer with the Sexual Assault Survivor Centre, and I told him about being a lay chaplain and how important it was for me to do this work as a Unitarian lay chaplain, and also about the Unitarians' emphasis on social justice. And, you know, since I became a Unitarian, we have worked hard to promote marriage equality and also medical assistance in dying. So I just wanted to show them that every person is different, every life can be celebrated. And the third objective was, I just wanted them to understand that death is natural and not to be feared. And that's why, you know, I chose me as a life to celebrate, that I'm not afraid of death and dying, and I wanted them to learn to accept that reality. It was very obvious from the beginning, as I mentioned, that the students from Northern were really uncomfortable being in a funeral home. I mean, they really showed it visibly. I don't know if it was their first time in a funeral home or if they had never experienced a death in the family. But anyway, after my presentation, I just said, you know, does anyone have any questions? And there was silence for a few moments, and then one young man put his hand up. I said, yes, you have a question. He said, yeah, is it okay if I go get a drink of water? So anyway, hopefully I got some of my message across. Christopher Plummer, I'm sure you've all heard of Christopher Plummer, the famous Canadian actor of stage, screen, and television. He performed many years, many times in Stratford. And when he was in his 80s, his final performance was in Stratford, and Dorothy and I went to Stratford to hear his final performance. And it was basically a retrospective on his life. And he shared some plays that he had acted in. He shared some, you know, excerpts from Shakespeare, and you know, it was just wonderful to hear him, you know, rehash his career, his wonderful career. But towards the end, he was in his 80s by this time, and he had won an Oscar when he was in 1982, when he was, I think he was around 82 or 84 years old when he won the Oscar. He was the oldest person ever to win an Oscar at that time. But towards the end of his performance in Stratford, he shared something that really disappointed me and shocked me, to be honest. And I'm going to quote him literally here, and pardon the language, but he said, I realize I don't have long to live, being in my mid-80s, and the thought of dying scares me shitless. That was his exact words. And that's what I remembered from his performance. And I remembered leaving the theater feeling, oh, did he really have to do that? Because that just spoiled. It was supposed to be a celebration of the English language, so why would he use that word for a start? But it just shows you how some people really are afraid of death and dying. So Christopher Plummer did die in 2021 at the age of 91. He fell at home, banged his head. I don't think he died immediately, but he obviously had a brain hemorrhage and he died later that day. But when Christopher Plummer woke up that morning, I'm pretty sure he did not begin the day thinking, this is my last day of living, and by the end of this day I will be dead. He had no idea that he was going to die that day. But he did wake up with a conscious or unconscious belief, a fear of death. And it's really sad to think that such a brilliant man was never able to come to terms and accept his mortality. So what advice did the ancient philosophers offer on death and dying? Marcus Aurelius, who was also known as the philosopher king, he ruled the Roman Empire for 19 years in the 2nd century AD. He died in 180 AD during the Antonine Plague, which was probably smallpox. So he probably died from smallpox. I think he was about 59 years old. Marcus and the other ancient Roman philosophers had no fear of death or of dying. They had a popular saying that they often used, memento mori, memento mori, remember you will die, remember I will die. And they often said that to themselves and to others. Marcus and his wife Faustina had 13 children, and 8 of them died before Marcus. So they lost 8 of their children. How devastating is that? The other Roman philosopher, Seneca, said, to learn how to die is to unlearn how to be a slave. Or to paraphrase, to learn and accept that you will die is to unlearn how to be a slave. So there is a meditation practice recommended by Marcus Aurelius and the other Roman philosophers of the time. And this at first may seem overly morbid, but when you do it, you will recognize its value. So it's a visualization meditation. And what they recommend that you do is that you find a quiet time and place to meditate, and you visualize yourself as being dead, lying in a coffin or on a bed, and just visualize yourself being dead and realize that this is what's going to happen to you at some point. Today, tomorrow, next year, 10 years. It will happen. And when you meditate on this for a while, you become accepting and comfortable with the fact that, yeah, I will die. It's natural. And then you take your visualization meditation to the next level. Then you visualize someone you love being dead, your spouse, your children. Visualize them lying dead. Hopefully they will not die before you, but anything is possible. That can be painful, of course, but once you practice this visualization meditation, it gives you a deeper appreciation for your loved ones. Yes, my spouse, my children, my grandchildren are mortal. I must learn to love them as much as I can while I'm alive, because nothing is guaranteed. So when you do this meditation, you become mindful of all that you cherish, yourself and your loved ones, even your own breath. Every life, every breath you take, you realize is a precious gift. And the fact that our death is unpredictable and outside our control gives new urgency to learning to appreciate your life and your loved ones' lives, and to value them with a much more deeply held gratitude. I'll share a quote from Megan Mooney. Megan Mooney runs death cafes in Missouri. And she says, if you look at life from the vantage point of death, you can see how beautiful life is. And that's what Carl Sagan was saying earlier. The English writer E.M. Foster wrote, yes, death destroys a life. Death destroys a man, but the idea of death saves him. Simple and profound. When death comes, we will embrace it as a call of nature. So I'll end with a quote by the German writer, poet, painter Hermann Hesse. Joe, am I saying that right? Hesse. Hesse, okay, Hermann Hesse. Thank you. He wrote, the call of death is a call of love. Death can be sweet if we answer it in the affirmative, if we accept it as one of the great eternal forms of life and transformation. And just let me share one quick thing too, is that when I do a service, I often incorporate a little bit of indigenous wisdom. And Jenny is here today. She's Ojibwe. And this is what I say. I say the indigenous people say that every life is a circle. Some of the circles are large, some of the circles are small, but every circle is complete. Thank you.